Welcome everyone to the Delphi Economic Forum and to a conversation unfolding in truly turbulent and fascinating times. We have trade wars, we have shifting geopolitical alliances, we have the introduction of AI in our lives. And I think we can say in many ways that this feels like the end of the world as we know it. Countries are being forced to rethink how they grow, compete, survive. Greece is in a critical junction, and organizations like OECD have to rethink their role and how they need to lead. So I think this conversation we're going to have is about reform, resilience, and who's really ready for the next crisis. So I have great, exceptional speakers next to me. I have Mr. Kyriakos Pierakakis. He's the Finance Minister of Greece, recently appointed. And next to him, I have Mathias Cormann. He's the Secretary General of OECD. And I would like to start with you, Mr. Cormann. The White House has reignited trade tensions, imposing sweeping tariffs on the EU and simultaneously to so many countries. Are we officially entering a second era of transatlantic trade war, or is this a high-stake negotiation tactic from the Trump administration?
Well, the first point I would like to make in response to the introduction is that I'm not sure that the OECD needs to rethink its role. I mean, our role is to provide objective evidence and facts on the outcomes of policy choices, and I think the world needs positive, objective evidence and facts more than ever to help inform conversations and hopefully help facilitate better decisions. And the OECD is a platform and a forum to facilitate dialogue and international cooperation and to find common and shared challenges solutions to shared challenges. And I think the world needs that more than ever. And we're, of course, an organization that is based on the principles of freedom, democracy, market-based economic principles, the sustainable expansion of global trade, international cooperation, which I think are all principles that remain highly relevant today. Now, when it comes to the US tariff announcements, and I'm not privy to any particular information on what the intention is in terms of decisions from here, out of the White House. What I would say is that already in our most recent economic outlook in March that we updated since December, which was before the 2 April announcement and before the announcement this morning, we had already downgraded the outlook for the global economy in terms of the growth outlook. We had already upgraded our outlook when it comes to inflation, and of course in the lead up to our next economic outlook in June, in the margins of Ministerial Council meeting, based on what has happened so far, if there is no further change, then we would expect that there would be a further reduction in our expected level of global growth. There would be further upward pressure, further increases in terms of our inflation outlook, which, of course, is not the direction that we would want to go. And the message that I'm giving to everyone is that, to the extent that there are issues to be addressed in global markets and in our global rules-based trading system, and there should be better ways to address them than through unilateral tariffs, that we would encourage everyone to engage with each other, to find, proactively to find solutions on a bilateral and multilateral basis, including through the OECD, to tackle things like unfair trade practices, to continue to make progress in terms of leveling the global playing field, in terms of dealing with supply chain resilience issues, economic security, and so on, but to do so without resorting to tariffs and while keeping markets open. I mean, that is very much the position of the OECD. We prefer and we stand for and we strongly encourage positive bilateral engagement, multilateral engagement to resolve any policy differences and issues rather than to pursue an approach of unilateral measures.
But this doesn't seem to be the case right now. So on your revision, how big would be the revision for a slowdown?
Well, we always go through an orderly process in revising our economic growth forecast, and we'll be announcing that in early June. But I mean, the direction of traffic, based on what we know now, is that if everything stays the same, we would expect global growth to be lower and inflation to be higher. What I should say is that as we go forward, if our assumption is right, if our hypothesis is right, that these sorts of widespread tariff measures lead to lower growth and higher inflation, then that will start to come through in the data, it will start to come forward in the evidence, and it will hopefully improve the quality of the conversation here and in the United States.
Mm-hmm. Minister, as an EU member, Greece is directly exposed to tariffs, maybe not in such extent as other countries, but there's an estimation of 1 billion indirect GDP impact, more or less. Are you more concerned, though, about second-order effects? I mean, rising global uncertainty, recession risk?
Let me begin by saying that it's great to share the stage with Mathias Cormann, with whom I collaborated very closely in the context of my previous ministerial capacities in education and in digital transformation and in the Global Strategy Group. By definition, we will collaborate more now in this capacity and in those challenging times, or I would say interesting times, as the Chinese proverb says, may you live in interesting times. Now, vis-a-vis the Greek stance on this, we're a free trading nation in a free trading union. We're very skeptical of tariffs, by definition. This is what we learn at school in fundamental economics, from the repeal of the Corn Laws in the 19th century to the Smoot-Hawley Act in the 1930s. We learn that tariffs are bad for the economy, and this creates adverse effects. We don't yet know what those effects will be per se. You mentioned the first-order effects. Mm-hmm. If you read the first-order effects, they're low for Greece. Why? Because we have a small share of exports to the United States. It's less than 5% of our total share of exports, primarily in agricultural products, cement, aluminum, and in a series of other industries, but limited. It would be, though, quite hypocritical to focus only on the first-order effects, because the core element potentially for us would be the second-order effects. I would say out of three potential variables. The first one being uncertainty, which is problematic for the market. The second one being a potential recession happening in EU markets, which are the core markets that primarily affect us. And the third one would be the European response to the original American decision. Now, especially with regards to the latter, I would say and reiterate again that we, as the Greek government, we would be very skeptical vis-a-vis responding to tariffs excessively with tariffs. I think that we should be very conservative in terms of how we treat this specific instrument, exactly because of the fact that we believe that this is adversely wrong for the economy. We, as a member state of the European Union, seek to primarily focus on protecting our national interests in this debate. We will, of course, shape together collectively and implement the European decision, but as a primary stance, we're very conservative and very skeptical about the specific policy instrument.
Mr. Cormann, what do you think should be the EU-level response?
Well, I mean, I think that the line that my good friend Kyriakos has just put forward, I think, is a sensible line. I mean, I think a trade war and like back and forth tariff wars is not in the interest of anyone. I mean, I think we've got to try in the best possible way to calmly and strategically and in a coordinated fashion engage with what is emerging and find ways and, you know, hopefully supported by objective data and evidence in the not too distant future to engage in a more constructive bilateral and multilateral dialogue to find better ways to deal with some of the issues that have been rightly identified as needing to be resolved when it comes to global markets and the rules-based global trading system.
A question for both of you. Elon Musk recently said that he suggested a future with zero tariffs between EU and the US. Do you think this is a fantasy, or could a transatlantic free trade agreement take place?
That's a great aspiration. It's one that I strongly support, and I wish Elon Musk great success in persuading the President of the United States along those lines.
I mean, broadly speaking, as I mentioned, we're against tariffs, and we literally believe, because your first question was, is it a policy or is it a negotiation? Every policy has an element of negotiation, tacitly or vividly, or by articulating it. But even tacitly, there are game theoretical elements in any such policy. How you respond to the original decision made is what will define the spectrum and the number of rounds that we will have in this game. I mentioned the Smoot-Hawley Act of the 1930s. It was not a unilateral tariffs act on behalf of the United States. It involved a series of rounds of responses, which eventually led to an average level of tariffs on behalf of the US being 60%, and which further led to a deepening of the Great Depression then. So this is why one should be very conservative in terms of defining what has happened and saying that this is the end result. It's not the end result. It will be defined by our further response to this. So ideally, we want a zero tariffs environment, but we should also be frank vis-a-vis the challenges that we face as a union. For us, the Draghi report, the Letta report, should be the north and the compass. What does the Draghi report say? It says that we have internal barriers within the union. In manufacturing, they're in the area of 45%. In services, they're in the ballpark figure of 110% of equivalent tariffs. We should be focusing a lot on removing those barriers, because if you look at the trade of services and goods happening within the European Union, it's less than half compared to the trade of services and goods happening within states of the United States. Yeah, so we should focus more on this, and we should focus more on barrier removal and diminishing of administrative burdens within the Union.
Is this, though, the discussion that takes place with your colleagues in Europe right now, or there's also the danger that, you know, Washington might try to do unilateral agreements with each member state? Do you feel that there's a will to be all united and have a common
I think that this
answer?
will happen by definition. I will be heading to Poland at the end of the week for the ECOFIN, the Eurogroup meetings. I think we're by definition a trade union, so by definition we should have a single response which will be collectively shaped by the discussions that we will have with our colleagues, with the other member states. And to answer to your first point, yes, implementing the Draghi report on removing internal barriers is a topic of discussion in those debates, and it should be.
Mr. Cormann, do you think this is this trade shock, if actually is applied, could be an opportunity? Are there like chances to reorient towards, for Europe, I mean, towards new markets, attract new businesses and diversify?
Well, look, I certainly hope that the situation we are currently in is not the situation where we end up in the final analysis when it comes to US tariffs on economies around the world. But having said that, and again, I mean, I very strongly support what Kyriakis has just said, and that is, I mean, the EU has got an incredible asset, which is its common market, but it's not leveraging that asset to its full potential. And when it comes to the services market, in fact, you know, intra-European trade barriers have gone up instead of going down, and that, of course, I mean, if I've said in my opening remarks just now, if the European Union lowered its intra-EU trade barriers for services to the same extent as is the case in the United States, you know, GDP would grow by about 7% over the next 7 years, like above.
How much you said?
7% over the next 7 years, and so. I mean, there are things that in the digital services market, you know, there's clearly things that need to be done in order to ensure across a broad section, cross-section of regulatory setting to better harmonize and remove barriers. The Capital Markets Union, I mean, it's long overdue to harmonize insolvency regimes and so on. And if what is happening out of the United States now provides further impetus and political momentum to tackle some of these long overdue reform priorities, then that's going to be a good thing for Europe. I mean, these are things that Europe should be doing anyway, and I do hope that what is happening out of the United States will ultimately be adjusted back to a better setting. But you know, if this provides an impetus for Europe to make some decisions that need to be made, then that's going to be a good thing.
In Greek economy, recovery and resilience funds are finishing in 2026. We have 7 years of strong growth. Foreign direct investment is still below the EU average. There is uncertainty, and we said, which doesn't really help. How do you plan to reboot some kind of momentum? I mean, is there any way that you can find other patches that there could be growth?
Well, I would say by doubling down on the pre-existing policy that we have on fiscal stability on the one hand, which I would say is not a policy choice post-IMF bailouts, it's a regime, and we should be following this regime because it's fundamental, it's existential for our economy. And on the other hand, on unleashing a spectrum of reforms where the role of the OECD, I think, is critical vis-a-vis the toolkit and how to diminish administrative burdens and implement reforms within your economy. Now, having said this, if you look at what's happening with investments over GDP, we dropped to 10% in terms of investments as a share to our GDP. in 2019, and now we have reached 15.5%. The EU average is 20%. So there is an investment gap, but more, I would say around 60% of that gap is covered. We need to run faster. We need to implement even more reforms. We need to think out of the box in terms of implementing them. I will just cite one such reform in the context of my previous hat, the private university bill, which has been a debate in Greece for decades. Apart from having an educational impact, has an economic impact. If you look at what the 12 proposals include vis-à-vis their announcement, it's a $500 million investment without the spillover effects and without the multiplier effect in the economy announced in terms of buildings and human resources, hiring professors within the next 5 years. There's an analysis currently being made vis-à-vis the GDP impact of this, which is probably going to be much higher. So, unleashing such reforms was the debate in the Economic Council, which we had a couple of days ago, where all the economic line ministries have to coordinate in terms of diminishing regulations, cutting red tape, and orchestrating our actions better, I would say. And you can see that, in many things. Take data centers. We passed, I think, a very targeted regulation back in 2020, a piece of legislation, rendering Greece a public cloud-first policy country at the beginning, which was a signal to Microsoft, Amazon, Google to come and locate their data centers here. This should be met by cutting red tape in terms of where they will be located, zoning, etc. And there were some delays in terms of that. So this better orchestration will allow for unleashing more growth in the future. That's the best policy option that we have, and I think that we can act also in terms of our fiscal performance, which everyone knows is universally acknowledged to be sound, as a signal to the markets that this place is actually a beacon of stability.
Sorry, and I just need to correct one data point that I previously provided, and that is the estimates, our estimates, indicate that if barriers to service trade in the EU were reduced to US levels, the level of EU labor productivity would be almost 7% higher after 7 years. So that was the data point in terms of, so that which would boost EU competitiveness, of course.
Minister, you spoke about red tape and reducing it. How, do you have any concrete steps underway? I mean, we've been, since the beginning of the crisis, we've been talking about reducing red tape, but you see in so many sectors, there's so much licensing, so much bureaucracy in order to start a business, get a license in something. How are you aiming to reduce that?
Well, Greece, unlike most other places that I know of, actually has a data set of mapping the full scope of services and I would say processes that it has vis-à-vis the interaction that the government has with citizens or corporations. Actually, we never, I would say, communicated this to the extent that we should have. We communicated digital services, gov.gr, but there is a platform called Mythos, mythos.gov.gr, where we have codified the full scope of services that we offer to citizens and corporations. Mm-hmm. And I think that this is effectively an X-ray of the Greek state. No other country that I know of has done this at such a comprehensive and granular scope. Now, mapping it is the first step. Now you need to solve it. It is properly mapped. It has mapped around more than 5,000 services that we offer to citizens. The equivalent for businesses is business process reengineering. So we should do state process reengineering. And we should primarily focus this on processes where you have a strong multiplier effect in the economy. Buying and selling property is the obvious one. But I would say that there are many others which we have debated for a long time, and we haven't yet diminished the steps. And what you will see in this platform, which is publicly available and you can access it, is that for every specific service that we offer to citizens, the explicit number of steps, the paperwork required, the digital services associated, the average cost, the average time, the relevant legal frameworks, everything is there at the platform.
So the mapping is there, but from mapping to actually reducing the red tape?
Well, the only response which is proper there is tautological. You do it by doing it, and now is the time to do it. It's there, we have the political will to solve it, and we plan to coordinate together with the other ministries which touch upon the specific services and the specific steps. The Ministry of Investments, Mr. Theodorikakos, the Ministry of Interior, we will all collectively cooperate to increase government efficiency in the coming months. It will be a goal publicly set by the Prime Minister. We have to do this. It's part of the Draghi report and the spirit of the Draghi report, which touches upon, of course, the trade of goods and services between EU member states. We should also focus on our own red tape. So in the spirit of this report, we plan to do the same in the coming months.
One of the major problems in Greek economy, and it's always highlighted by the IMF reports, is the shrinking Greek population. Mm-hmm. And I want to ask Mr. Cormann, what should the Greek government do about it? Is it migration, manage migration that could sustain long-term productivity? Is it upskilling? What would it be?
Well, I mean, firstly, we've got to acknowledge how much work the Greek government has actually done in boosting employment participation and in bringing down very sharply the unemployment rate here in Greece. I mean, unemployment in February was at 8.6%, down from a peak of about 27.9% back in 2013, and the long-term average is about 14.9%. So at 8.6%, the unemployment rate is markedly below the sort of long-term average. But it is also true that the employment participation rate in Greece is still well below the OECD average. So there is actually still a lot that can be achieved by boosting the level of workforce participation by both men and women, and to make up some of the impact of population aging on participation rates over the medium to long term. I mean, migration, of course, skilled migration can be an important part of the answer. In Greece, I guess there is a language question that sort of comes into this, which makes that perhaps a bit more challenging than for other economies, depending on the types of jobs. And yes, I mean, making sure that you optimize the outcomes, or that you optimize the productivity of your human capital in your country, including through high levels of education and skills development, upskilling, reskilling, making sure that the skills development matches the needs of the economy. I mean, these are all important parts of the overall strategy. But let me just say the most important opportunity for Greece is really to continue to work towards lifting the level of workforce participation across the Greek economy. There's still opportunity to improve.
Do you have any specific recommendations?
Well, this is what we are recommending to the Greek government, and to continue to pursue efforts to incentivize increased workforce participation, to, of course, I mean, continue to reform education and skills development approaches, which the government is doing in order to help boost productivity.
You have praised Greece's fiscal performance and digital transition. You have the minister, the ex-minister next to you, but there feels that, there hasn't been enough in the justice reform, public sector reform, the efficiency. What would you pinpoint as the major sector that needs to reform ASAP?
In terms of in Greece, I mean, what we are essentially saying is to stay the course when it comes to fiscal consolidation and bringing down the level of debt, pursue reforms to boost labour productivity, and I mean, this is an across-the-board proposition. I mean, these are probably the two most important areas of focus, and these are indeed areas of focus for the government that we know that they're continuing to pursue.
Mm-hmm. Minister, what do you, I mean, you have freshly been appointed, and there is one of always the metrics that are, what we discussed before, that's Greece is lagging, is the foreign direct investment. When you see foreign investors, what's the main issue that they have, and how can you facilitate someone to come and invest in Greece when, we're not back in 2018 where wages were lower, opportunity were larger. We are after a 7-year cycle of growth.
Well, I would say, looking at Greece circa 2019, if I were to make a comparison, using the language of a computer scientist, I would say that Greece always had the hardware but lacked the software, which was having the proper piece of institutions, the specifics that you needed to have on the ground for investment to unleash its potential and have the maximum effect. The fact that Greece was politically unstable was a huge problem. Political stability is something that investors seek, and political stability we currently have.
But investors still are lagging.
But I would say a full scope of things. Okay, political stability being one of them, the investment grade being another, the de-escalation of debt being another. So if you look at the metrics, the fiscal health of the economy is better. What we should do, I would say, even more systematically, is to do all the scope of the reforms that you mentioned before. Basically things where we collaborate with the OECD, removing barriers, cutting red tape, further reforming the justice system, public administration, making the level playing field more level compared to what one would face internationally. But overall, the fiscal status and the political and economic stability status of Greece is something which I would say investors much appreciate in the interactions that we already have with them. We need to remove the rest of the barriers.
But what you are saying, we've heard it many times from your predecessors as well, so it means that it's really, really hard to happen, or there was no political will. Why this time will it be different?
Well, political will is there. It is hard to happen. There are certain areas where we have been debating things for a very long time, and it took us some time to mature. I mentioned the private university bill. The discussion of this was since 1986. It happened by this government. The discussion of digital transformation is something which I remember since when I was a student. It happened by this government. A series of other reforms are happening by this government for the first time. To be frank, the reforms that Greece needed in 2019, the scope of those reforms was 360 degrees. It was huge. So some things have already happened, some things have yet to happen. The political will is there, the message of the public, and basically what they said by voting us is complete those reforms. So what I can say is that we plan to do the job, and we will.
Mr. Cormann, are you satisfied by the reform power of the country, or the government? Should they do more in certain areas that you think are a major impediment for growth?
Well, I mean, as I said in one of my earlier answers, I mean, I think that over the last 5 or 6 years, I mean, I think the Greek economy has been very much on the right path. I mean, growth has been strong. The unemployment rate has come down very rapidly. I mean, there's been a rapid reduction in the level of debt as a share of GDP, even though it's still very high by OECD standards. I mean, it came from about 180% as a share of GDP to about 150 in 2019, that is just before the COVID spike, to about 150% thereabouts at the end of last year. And I think the forecast is for it to go below 150% this year. So that, I mean, that's all good. I mean, the main areas, I mean, to focus on, as I've said, is, I mean, labor productivity in Greece is still much too low compared to the OECD average. I mean, I think that the workforce participation, of older, like, I mean, when I say older, I mean, men in their 50s in Greece is well below the OECD average. Workforce participation of women across the Greek economy is below the OECD average. I mean, they're all areas where the government can do more work, and we would certainly encourage a continued commitment to fiscal consolidation and debt reduction as a way of further building resilience in the context of future economic shocks, but also to create capacity with spending pressures related to population aging, defense requirements, and the like.
You want a final comment? We have 15 seconds.
My final comment, I think, will echo what I said at the beginning, that we plan to collaborate very closely with the OECD vis-à-vis integrating and metabolizing the messages and the specific policy recipes that they will provide in order to provide the maximum boost to the economy by reforming it, especially in the areas where we see the highest potential of producing those reforms.
Thank you very much, both of you. And I will